Hello, my name is Claude Butner, and I have the honor of being your host today. Dr. Melissa A. Kenney is the Director of Research and Knowledge Initiatives at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment, also known as I&E, where she directs efforts to build synergy across I&E's broad scientific research portfolio. To achieve this goal, she collaborates with faculty, community partners, the University of Minnesota's system-wide campuses, and the I&E staff to launch knowledge initiatives in support of I&E's impact goal initiatives on carbon neutrality, sustainable land use, and safe drinking water. Among her many accomplishments, she is an author of the Adaptation Chapter of the 5th U.S. National Climate Assessment and was an author of the Decision Support Chapter of the 3rd U.S. National Climate Assessment. Her official bio is at the linked address in the notes. Climate change is the warming of the Earth that occurs as a result of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, CO2, accumulating in the atmosphere and trapping heat. In all regions of the U.S., climate change has caused impacts such as increased temperatures, heavy precipitation, and sea level rise. These impacts will continue and the risk will accelerate without rapid and deep reductions in greenhouse gases globally. This climate adaptation is a critical approach. Thus, climate adaptation is a critical approach to managing the risk of current and future climate impacts. Adaptation is the, open quotes, process of adjusting to an actual or expected environmental change and its effects in a way that seeks to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities, end quotes. In this talk, she will share the major scientific consensus findings of the Adaptation Chapter of the 5th U.S. National Climate Assessment. In particular, she will discuss both the state of climate adaptation and well-known processes to increase the use of scientific information in climate adaptation decisions. Dr. Kenney, you have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you so much for welcoming me here today. It's a real pleasure to be with you all here virtually. I'm really excited to talk with you about insights from the 5th National Climate Assessment. We're going to focus on climate adaptation, and that's because climate adaptation is specifically what we can do as people to manage the risk that we know climate is already causing, not just within the US, but globally. To get us started, what I wanted to do is actually give you a sense of my own personal research expertise and why I care about climate adaptation. I'm an environmental decision support scientist. So that means that I think about really difficult decisions and I think about how we can get science into those decisions. So I work on problems where we're trying to understand and improve different processes. So processes of engagement between academics like myself, but also people who have expert well outside of university walls, and how we can work together to define and develop different kinds of decision support tools like models, indicators, forecasts, scenarios, different ways that help us to be able to provide important and complex scientific information in public and private sector decisions. I've worked in a wide range of different environmental topics, from climate change, adaptation and mitigation, to environmental management, to questions of community resilience and interdependent infrastructure decisions. More or less, if it's complex, it requires uncertain scientific information, and there's not a clear answer, then it's kind of my sweet spot of really interesting problems to work on. And so then to transition, you can probably get a sense of like why I, as a decision support scientist, really gravitate towards thinking about how we can synthesize the literature for something as important and complex as climate adaptation. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the findings from one of the chapters of the U.S. National Climate assessment. It's Chapter 31, which is adaptation. And just so you know, when we think about the National Climate Assessment, think about this as like the IPCC for the US, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the international scientific consensus report that's developed for the world. The US has that, and it's actually quite unique why we have it. So to just give you a little bit of background of the National Climate Assessment and the mandate and scope for it, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, it's also called USGCRP, was mandated by Congress as a result of the Global Change Research Act in 1990. It was designed to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. That includes climate change, but not exclusively climate change. What you see is that this is a coordinating body of, it's now 15 different federal departments and agencies. It's 15 because a new agency, HUD, was just admitted about a few months ago to really think about how to fulfill its full mission. One of the parts of the 1990 Global Change Research Act is Section 106, and that's the legislative origins for what we call the U.S. National Climate Assessment, or you might hear me say NCA for short. And in that act, it requires that not less frequently than every 4 years, USGCRP is mandated to prepare and submit a report to the President and Congress that assesses, which is an assessment that does 3 things. First, it integrates, evaluates, and interprets the findings of USGCRP and discusses scientific uncertainties associated with those findings. And because the USGCRP covers a wide range of different research that is conducted on climate change throughout the US, the body of scientific work that has been produced in the 4 years is a good proxy for those USGCRP findings. Secondly, it analyzes the effects of global change on the natural environment, agriculture, energy, production and use, land and water resources, transportation, human health and welfare, human social systems, and biological diversity. These are specific sectors that were called out in the legislation that are important for the report to directly address. And then finally, it analyzes current trends in global change, both human-induced and natural, and projects major trends in the subsequent 25 to 100 years. And so it is required by law not just to synthesize what has occurred historically, but also to give a sense of what the scientific literature says will occur in the future. Just a few things on the National Climate Assessment. It evaluates a wide range of scientific and technical inputs from diverse authoritative sources. There are requirements of what is considered an authoritative source. It uses best expert judgment through author teams to characterize uncertainty. These author teams included over 500 authors and well over 200 technical contributors that helped to form the conclusions that were part of the NCA. It's relevant for policy and decision making, but it does not prescribe specific policy interventions, and it does not advocate for a particular viewpoint. It is not a policy prescriptive document. It's a scientific assessment. It also assesses a wide range of potential impacts, and that's because we're really aiming for an assessment like this to provide the decision makers with the types of risks that could be avoided or reduced given what we know at this point in time. The NCA meets the letter of the law for the Global Change Research Act. There's lots of opportunities for public engagement, from setting the table of contents of what's going to be included in the National Climate Assessment, all the way through being a peer review participant for the findings of the assessment and providing public comment on that, to participating in a session like this where we're sharing the results of the assessment with folks broadly. And then finally, the NCA employs an extensive review process. And if you're a scientist, you've gone through peer review as you publish things. This is an incredibly extensive peer review process. It goes through multiple phases of peer review, and notably through the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. All of the comments that we receive do have to be responded to, so that every review that we get is thoughtfully considered by the chapter authors. And so then to move to the findings of the adaptation chapter, what I'd like to do is to take you through some of the top line findings of our chapter, and then we'll open it up for a conversation on some of the things that are of greatest interest to you. I might not have the answers to everything, but at least we'll have an interesting conversation about the possibilities of how we can respond to climate change through adaptation measures. So the first key message is that adaptation is occurring within the US, but it's insufficient in relation to the pace of climate change. In this key message, what we assessed was the diversity of adaptation activities that are occurring across the US. There's a lot going on. And what we've observed through the scientific literature is that the adaptation activities are increasingly moving from awareness and assessment towards planning and implementation. But what we're seeing is that there is limited advancement in monitoring and evaluation. And that is one of the key things needed in order to learn and improve and continually ensure that we're making adaptation choices that are managing for the risks that we're not just experiencing that, but those that we're expecting to experience. There's numerous social, economic, physical, and psychological barriers that are preventing more widespread adoption and implementation of adaptation measures, and current adaptation efforts and investments are insufficient to reduce today's climate-related risks and are unlikely to keep pace with future changes in the climate. And so as you think about this, it's more, the sense is, we're doing more than we did, but more is really needed to keep pace with the impacts that we're experiencing. One of the ways that we're able to assess that is just the level of publicly documented public and private sector adaptation activities, and especially whether or not particular locations have state level adaptation plans. You can notice the diversity of activities that we were able to assess given publicly available data sources and the literature across the US and US-based territories. You'll notice a number of states that have state level adaptation plans. You'll notice that Minnesota, I'm from Minnesota, so we are looking at Minnesota in particular. Minnesota does have a state level adaptation plan now. When we were assessing the data for the U.S. National Climate Assessment, there's a cutoff date by which scientific literature can be considered, and the state level plan had not been adopted at that point in time, and that's why you don't see that Minnesota has a state level plan. If you compare this to a similar figure that was done about 10 years ago, you'll notice an increase in the number of adaptation plans and adaptation activities that are going on, which is one of the many lines of evidence that we use to draw the conclusions we did for key message 1. So key message 2. Effective adaptation requires centering equity. In this key message, what we notice is that people and communities are affected by climate change in different ways. How people and institutions adapt really depends on a wide range of social factors, including individual and community preferences, capacity, and access to resources. Adaptation processes, decisions, and actions don't explicitly address the uneven distribution of climate harms and the social processes and injustices that are underlying these disparities, such as redlining, can exacerbate social inequities and increase exposure to climate harms and climate impacts. One of the ways that we think about this is that, these adaptation outcomes are the result of individual and group values and decision-making processes and constraint. So if you think about the diversity of adaptation options that exist, there's a wide range of things that factor in before you get to particular outcomes. There's things related to community culture, such as the history, social capital, values, risk perception, and tolerance. And then there's a range of decision-making criteria that narrow down the specific set of options that might be desired within a particular community or within one's own household. And those could be, include things like preferences, capabilities, resources, or particular processes that are put in place. Being able to understand a number of these different kinds of decision-making processes allows you to understand why a wider set of options might lead to certain outcomes. And as you look across the landscape, the types of outcomes that could lead to more equitable societal actions and outcomes for the communities there, and those that might lead to increased risk for particular communities. Moving on to key message 3, transformative adaptation will be needed to adequately address climate-related risks. So climate adaptation actions that have been undertaken in the US to date have generally been small in scale and incremental in approach. That involves minor changes to things that are more business as usual. Transformative adaptation, which involves more fundamental shifts in systems, values, and practices, will be necessary in many cases to adequately address the risks of current and future climate change. So in order to do that, new monitoring and evaluation methods will also be needed to assess the effectiveness and sufficiency of adaptation to address equity considerations. And so if you want to think about this, incremental and transformative adaptation might take many forms, but incremental adaptation really involves smaller changes, while transformative adaptation involves more profound shifts. So looking at this graphic, which on the y-axis indicates decreased climate risk, so that's a good thing, decreased climate risk, and on the x-axis indicates time, and time increasing over the long term. We can think about a couple of different scenarios to just kind of illustrate that concept. So the first is if you looked at scenario A, which is a green, and you were thinking about nature-based strategies that over time could build a transformed landscape. These are things like not just tree planting, but really thinking about how you might use like nature-based shorelines to manage for sea level rise and erosion, how you might be able to create migration corridors that allow for shifts in where the landscape will be. One of the things about nature-based solutions is that when you put them in, they're the weakest, but over time, if you built them smartly, then they increase in their ability to manage risks. And so over time, you see dramatic increases in their ability to support climate risk reduction. Looking at scenario B, what you can do is think about how landowners, lots of different people across the landscape, shifting land use and transforming practices parcel by parcel over a larger landscape. Those smaller farm level changes can lead to larger transformative changes, because many small changes can lead to quite bold changes on a landscape. Scenario C thinks about entire communities that might choose to move away from flood prone waterfronts. There's certain communities that might be built below the flood zone right now, and are under sea level, are below sea level rise, and so they are at high risk for flooding. Figuring out ways of moving entire communities where you are also protecting a number of those communities that might be more impoverished because those were the only places that they could afford to buy a house, allows for a shift in thinking about transformative solutions, because what you'll see is that kind of single large-scale bold change creates some non-linear shifts. So you might be creating some decrease in climate change risk, but because you made that shift and now you no longer have people living in those places, over time those communities are no longer at risk because they've been able to migrate from those locations. In scenario D, what you're seeing is that one where a particular option might actually increase risk over time. So, for example, increased use of fossil fuel powered air conditioning can contribute to greater climate risk. So one of the adaptation measures when we have hotter summers is to increase air conditioning risk, which, if we're powering that air conditioning with fossil fuel, will increase climate change over time, especially if it's done at scale, and can cause greater warming in the summer. So it's actually increasing climate risk over time. And then finally, looking at scenario E, strategies like precision irrigation can reduce drought risk. But if water scarcity remains high because of increased evapotranspiration or lack of aquifer replenishment, or shifts in the ability for the precipitation to come at ideal times, you can decrease climate risk, but irrigation will only have a certain amount of risk reduction that it can achieve. Larger strategies, bolder strategies will be needed to really manage for drought risk and water scarcity that exists in those landscapes. So shifting to key message 4, effective adaptation governance empowers multiple voices to navigate competing goals. Adaptation involves actors from government, private sector, non-governmental institutions such as nonprofit and not-for-profit and for-profit institutions, civil society organizations, and all of those different types of actors have different priorities and approaches. Adaptation decision makers must balance between those kinds of competing goals while also addressing uncertainties regarding future climate change and the ways that political, social, and technological systems will be transformed. To minimize the potential for adaptation actions to benefit some at the expense of others, adaptation processes must emphasize collaboration, center equity and justice, and incorporate a wide range of values and knowledge sources. So if you look at climate adaptation, and you want to think about the numerous actions that are thought about by different actors at multiple jurisdictional scales. This is a graphic that helps us to think about that global to local scale, and then different kinds of actions that could be taken by different kinds of actors. So at the global scale, we have groups like IPCC, UN, other international bodies, multinational businesses. At the local scale, we have local government, individuals, civil society, community-based organizations. Different kinds of actions are feasible and most appropriate at different scales. And when you see something crossing both of them, they're crossing different groups of it. So for example, with global, actions might include multilateral agreements like the Paris Accord, or funding. Multilateral agreements happen by bodies like the UN and other international bodies. Funding can happen through multinational businesses, and we're seeing that increasingly occur as there's shareholder accountability requirements, and also international policies in different places globally that are putting pressure on transparency and accounting in ways that filter to other countries that might not have those laws and regulations. One of the key things to make that those actions effective is tracking and monitoring so that you have the transparency and accountability of what is occurring. And that's both for multilateral agreements and funding. So I'll just pause here to give you a second to take a look at all of this, since we will walk through each of these different graphics. Switching to key message 5, adaptation requires more than just scientific information and understanding. As you can guess, this is one that's near and dear to my heart as a decision support scientist, because adaptation effectiveness, especially when we're thinking about it in a changing climate, requires both decision relevant climate information and evidence-based decision-making approaches. Adaptation requires that researchers intentionally collaborate with communities to identify goals, assess vulnerability, improve capacity, and address contextual factors such as value, culture, risk perception, and historic injustices. Climate services can be improved by ensuring access for historically disinvested communities and by attention to procedural and recognitional equity when scientists work with communities and decision makers. So let's just talk about what this might look like. So climate services, which is a way of saying, how are you providing scientific information in a way that it supports community understanding and decision making? It can be designed to support transformative and equitable adaptation. So if we're looking at this table, if you're thinking about incremental adaptation and there's a low engagement by different communities and stakeholders, one of the questions you can ask is, are climate services enabling maladaptation? Are we failing to be ambitious enough and take in enough of the voices in order to adapt effectively and manage risk? If we have low engagement and we're seeking transformative adaptation, one of the questions that we can ask is, are services supporting equity? Are we developing climate services and supporting transformative adaptation solutions that will lead to certain groups of people not being left behind? In places where you have high engagement of different communities and you're advancing incremental adaptation, one of the questions you can ask is, are services being operationalized? Are they easier to access so that people are able to use them in a wide range of decisions? And then finally, if there's high engagement and you're advancing transformative adaptation, the question then becomes, are services sustained and mainstreamed? Are we able to scale this in a way that allows for adaptation to really meet the risk management demands that are occurring. And then finally, key message 6, adaptation investments and financing are difficult to track and may be inadequate. Investments in adaptation are being made at federal, state, territorial, tribal, and local levels, as well as within the private sector, but they're not always evenly distributed, coordinated, tracked, or reported. And there may be in that tracking is inadequate. Like we really need to know what's going on in order to be able to assess the effectiveness of and adequacy of our adaptation actions. Future adaptation investment needs are expected to be significant, although projected amounts vary due to uncertainty in future emission trajectories, what we choose as humans to do in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, associated impacts, and the timing of implementation. Proactive adaptation can reduce some of the most severe costs of future climate change, particularly under very high emission scenarios that are anticipated in the late 21st century. Although adaptation is still needed in the present for communities, and infrastructure may not be well adapted to face current climate conditions. So if we think about what this looks like, if you're looking at the average annual change in costs, what you're seeing here is different climate emissions scenarios. RCP 4.5, which is a lower emission scenario, and RCP 8.5, which is a higher emission scenario. And we're looking at this comparing 2050 timeframes to 2090 timeframes. The future costs associated with climate change will depend on the adaptation efforts as well as the emission scenarios that occur. So, for example, if there is no adaptation that occurs, then we will have higher costs in comparison to if we have reactive adaptation, so adaptation actions that are put into place given roads that have degraded or that have need repair because of disasters. And that reactive adaptation costs are higher than if we are doing proactive adaptation, where we are anticipating where roads might be flooded, where we might need to have more heat resistant technologies. And that's true both for roads, rail, as well as a number of other sectors. The diversity of different infrastructures or sectors that we might want to assess was more limited than we might have liked. And it's because of the lack of reporting on financial costs of adaptation. So I'd like to give recognition to the co-authors of the team, particularly our chapter lead, Emily Wasley. And with that, I'll leave you with both the recommended citation and the DOI link to the chapter if you want to take a look at it. You can read both the full chapter, but if you want to look at the entire U.S. National Climate Assessment Report, that's available at https://NCA2023.globalchange.gov. And with that, thank you. It's so wonderful to be with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. That's a very meaty presentation, and especially that you ended on where we can actually go to the original source and wade through it. But you've done a great summary here. I'm going to not ask my prerogative as the host the first question. We'll go right to Dave Doherty, a retired ecologist, and John Hollins. You are on deck. Go ahead and speak.
Thank you very much, Claude. And thank you for the talk, Melissa. I'm wondering, perhaps you don't feel qualified to make a comment on this, but if you do, Do you think that the scientific community in the USA believes that the incoming administration will abolish any of the agencies involved in the NCA? And if so, which ones?
I cannot speak to the entire scientific community. I would say two things. One is the incoming Trump administration, I think, has made their priorities if they plan to follow Project 2025. USGCRP is called out in Project 2025 as one of the entities that it is it's keeping that it doesn't view favorably. The one thing with the U.S. Global Change Research Program is that it's required by law. They would have to think carefully about the 1990 Global Change Research Act. In the previous Trump administration, the fourth National Climate Assessment was released on time and delivered the day after the U.S. Thanksgiving. And so I don't know. If I was a clairvoyant and could predict what would happen in the next 4 years, I'd be a really rich woman. But I would say, from my perspective, it's law of the land until it's not. I'm a chapter lead of the 6th National Climate Assessment, leading a chapter on the science of response management, which is thinking about how effective and sufficient is the combination of adaptation, mitigation, and resilience measures that we're putting in within the US, given climate change. And until I'm told not to, we're moving forward full force because we still have a report to deliver in 4 years. And so I think the incoming administration has made their perspectives on environmental policies quite clear.
So normally organizations probably would have a plan B or a backup in the back pocket. Has there been any discussion amongst the leaders of your organization as to what you will do if, in fact, the administration goes ahead and guts one or more of the important agencies that contribute to the assessments?
You know, that until we have a new administration, it's premature to talk about anything that would occur with a future national climate assessment. The guidance that we've been given is that, you know, the assessment's apolitical. Like we're not doing something that's politically motivated. We're providing a scientific assessment. And since we're assessing a diversity of scientific literature, that scientific literature exists, and we move forward with that regardless of what moves around and the other aspects of sort of the political winds. And so we'll see what happens. I think there's a deep commitment by those of us that do these kinds of scientific assessments to ensure that the science is rigorously assessed, that we are providing it in a timely way, and that we are supporting it in ways that help people to make really difficult decisions, because that needs to happen regardless of who's filling the role of a president.
Okay, thank you very much, and good luck. You may well need it.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And Anitra, you are on deck for your questions. And now John Hollins has the floor.
Thank you.
Good day. Thank you very much. That was an excellent answer you gave to Dave's political question. It suggests to me that we need people with your kind of skills and ability and language in Congress, not talking to them from the outside.
I'm not sure I have the temperament for it or the patience.
I really appreciated the way you brought the concept of variation, which is standard in your kind of science and my kind of science, very rarely gets into the broader public domain, but your attention to your statement of levels of detail at least plants the idea. So thank you for that as well. Now, you have 5 scenarios, and they're very plausible, easy to understand. I want to ask you if you have considered doing a scenario that at some time in the future there will be a very rapid collapse. Is that within your band of interest or program?
Yeah, so I think the reference to the scenarios of how you decrease climate risk, those were a way of illustrating different ways that kind of incremental to transformative adaptation can occur. Certainly, if there is rapid shifts in environmental conditions or social conditions, that can radically transform what is feasible, the kinds of choices that need to be made, and may eliminate certain strategies. And so, because the diagram that we presented was illustrative, it wasn't considering like a rapid catastrophic shift, but certainly if something like that occurred, or on the flip side, we had a disruptive technological innovation that could rapidly remove carbon from the atmosphere, it all of a sudden puts different options on the table. So it swings both ways, and ways that might create a more palatable atmosphere, and ones where we might see more rapid shifts because of socio-political instability due to droughts, famine, or other climate exasperated societal ills, or things that might be environmental disasters that occur. What you see with adaptation, it's catastrophic where it occurs, but I think is different in scale than what you're talking about, which is more of a larger scale global catastrophe. Is right now a lot of the adaptation investments are occurring through disaster risk management. So we're seeing more and more proactive adaptation activities occurring, but a lot of the reactive adaptation is because of disaster risk management, because there has been floods, there have been massive heat waves, there have been water scarcity or heavy precipitation that have occurred, and it requires a shift in how we are both building back but also responding, so that if we're making those build back investments, we're not just replacing, we're thinking about what might be occurring going forward. And that's the best case scenario. Like, we should not just be building back to what it was. If we know that the risks are increasing, we should be factoring that into sensible strategy for adaptation investments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Art, Hunter, you are on deck, and Anitra, you have the floor.
So my basic question, which has 2 parts, is the really needed adaptation, it seems to me, is cutting down on the consumption of fossil fuels by the public, by industries, by governments at all levels, from waste management to the military and to the overseas support that we give through the World Bank and the regional development banks, where we're putting in fossil fuel plants all over the world, particularly Africa and Asia. And how is the adaptation plan evaluating the consumption transformation from using fossil energy to using all the others which are not the same, and the mitigation which of course is bringing back our forests, which in the United States are 85% decimated, along with 90% of our coastal vegetation is decimated. And these were the things that scrubbed the fossil fuel from the air. So it seems to me that that whole equation of how to lower putting things into the air and getting them back out of the air and safely buried under the soil is one of the major transformations that could occur. And yet I don't hear the focus on that. And my second question is, are you thinking about, in terms of equity, doing some kind of a Gini evaluation where the two parts of the equation are the consumption of fossil fuel versus the equity in some way, such as the poverty, the lack of food, and so forth, a Gini coefficient, so that we could look state by state, region by region, and see where the really bad areas are that are not conforming to the stated goals.
Yeah, what great questions. So the first question, the short answer is this is one of 30 some odd chapters that are part of the National Climate Assessment, and there's an entire chapter dedicated to climate mitigation. But I think the point that you're making about the synergies between mitigation and adaptation, also how mitigation choices impact adaptation actions that are needed, is a really important one. And so thinking about that latter point, one of the things is that there's a number of adaptation strategies that are win-win. They reduce climate risk and they also reduce or lock in greenhouse gases. So for example, wetland restoration or conservation of high-level peatlands, the amount of carbon that is stored in those soils is tremendous. One of the reasons why we're seeing increases in greenhouse gases is not just through fossil fuel consumption, it's through warming that's leading to emissions being released from the land in places where that carbon and methane and other greenhouse gases were previously locked in. And so I think, strategies that think about both mitigation and adaptation as win-wins are really important ones. You also see things like blue carbon, which is carbon mitigation strategies that are in coastal and ocean systems. That's another buzzword for a lot of the strategies that you're talking about. I think the other piece of this is that this is maybe two things. One is there are choices that are made across the landscape where those choices might impact the types of adaptation actions that one might need to take. If we choose to release more greenhouse gases, or if there's acceleration such that there's feedbacks that lead to an amplification of climate change, then we will need to adapt more aggressively to manage the risks that we expect to see on the landscape. However, if we're able to aggressively and rapidly decarbonize our global footprint, and that's not just energy. Energy is about a quarter of it. We also have buildings, transportation, and then ag, land, and forestry. as another wedge, we have to think about how we're getting to deep decarbonization across all of those sectors, and that's rapid electrification so that then we can start electrifying various sectors. It's socio-behavioral changes that reduce our reliance on different kinds of fossil fuels, as well as increasing the ease at which you can use renewable energies or electrified sources from renewable energy, and it's both ease and cost access. There's going to be certain places in the world where rapid transition to things like electric vehicles will be trickier. Places in Canada, places in Minnesota, where we're in rural areas and you're not going to have the electric vehicle infrastructure, you have to be thinking about not just how you get to carbon zero, but how you're balancing amongst those. And if you can't zero out the transportation sector by just electrifying everything, how are you offsetting that? How are you transitioning that? Is that a hydrogen model? Is that a change in battery capacity? And if so, we've got to increase our cold technology approaches. Or is it thinking about carbon capture and other technologies that might be able to offset if we have to emit in certain areas because we won't have the infrastructure in order to fully be off of fossil fuels in the next few decades. And so I think you're hitting the nail on the head of like, it's very complex. There's a lot of feedbacks, and the choices that we make impact the type of adaptation that will be needed. And if we don't have an eye towards equity and how different communities will be impacted by climate change, and ensuring that we are giving equitable access to scientific information, financing, starting to transform some of the policies that lead to inequitable access, and then also supporting climate resilient decisions that allow the communities to make choices that will reduce their climate risk, but also put in the kinds of approaches that are acceptable to them. It's going to be difficult for this transformation that will be occurring over the next couple of decades to be done in ways that won't exacerbate existing inequities that are occurring both within the US but also globally.
Thank you. Thank you for a
Thank you.
very clear and excellent talk also. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay, Dave Pollock, you're on deck, and Art, you have the floor.
I listened to this, and I'm absolutely staggered by the magnitude of the task that you've taken on, or your organization. Because I look at this and I see two big forces at play. One is nature, of course, and nature is constantly looking for balance. And we're often in an area where we don't understand what nature is going to do next, as it's trying to achieve balance. And that balance, of course, takes places both at the macro and the nano level and everything in between. We also have this other major variable called human behavior. And some of this is good news, and some of it isn't, of course. The good news is there's already a fair amount of adaptation that is underway and is accelerating. I'm particularly enamored with your comments on rapid electrification, because I follow that and participate that in a very major way of electrifying everything. But the other thing that human behavior includes is, of course, fossil fuel propaganda and the desire to maintain the status quo, fake information, and all that. There are things like geopolitics, war, mass migration. All these
Right.
dynamics are underway, and sometimes competing with each other, which really has an impact ultimately on timing and quite a confusing, at least in my mind,
Yeah.
pile of forces that are pushing and in operation here. And of course, nature is going to have the final say. When I look at all this, and I also see what's happening in the world of the UN and COP, and they're wrestling, with the same problems, and so I then say to myself, what's your relationship to the UN and COP? Do you folks interact closely and share information and what have you to address what I think is a really difficult nonlinear problem?
Yeah. So as within the University of Minnesota Institute on the Environment, we support the University of Minnesota system. So we sit at a different level in the university. We're based in the Twin Cities campus, but we actually serve all 5 University of Minnesota campuses. So Twin Cities, Duluth, Crookston, Morris, and Rochester. And so we are the ones who administer the badges. We support students and faculty going to COP as observers, learners, and we also have researchers who are part of international climate negotiation delegations. So one of my colleagues, Famara Damfa, is one of the climate negotiators for the country of Gambia, which he's a citizen of. And so, so we do support that because those types of international conversations and like negotiations are critical when we have major things that emerge. Like the Paris Accord was one of the big ones where we were setting global targets for greenhouse gas reductions. I think one of the biggest things to keep an eye on right now within sort of the UN and COP is the Global Adaptation Indicator Framework. This is one that's intended to create transparency and accountability related to adaptation actions that are happening. How they're going to do it, I don't know. Like I develop indicators. I work with people on indicators, including adaptation indicators, and that's really hard. Like I don't admire the folks who are deeply embedded in it, and it's also critically important because once they have those, that sets transparency, accountability, also usually directs certain mechanisms of funding distribution. And so depending on how they set them, if those indicators aren't set in particular ways, it can be quite easy to game the system in order to be able to access resources and then show rapid success in achieving them, where it's really just sort of like manipulating the indicator than actually achieving meaningful outcomes. And so I think when we've got it right, we're able to measure things that matter, that are able to be transparently reported, and to create a level of shared accountability for people within our own country, but also to each other. And I think that's a really powerful thing when we're able to set it up. So if you're interested in things that might be quite influential in the next few years, that's the one that I'm closely keeping my eye on, because I think once they get that set up, it's going to be pretty impactful in how resources flow, especially to the least developed countries that are facing the greatest climate impacts.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Art.
Okay, John Legg, you are on deck, and David Pollack has the floor.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Melissa. I can imagine in the evenings when you go home, the number of variables that spin through your mind could reach an astonishing number at times. I've done some struggling with indicators, environmental indicators, over a past period of time. The question I had is not really what I'm trying to get at, but on the chat box, I said, how granular is the data? And the example I gave was, for example, individuals who have private jets contribute on an individual basis much more than any other individuals. The same one step down with those who spend a lot of time on cruise ships in terms of per person pollution. And that, so I was asking, is the data rolled up and aggregated more by sector? Well, in a sense, I know the answer to that question, but where that question comes from is, while on the one hand, you're trying to preserve a scientific integrity and to stay clear of a lot of the political landmines that this work can fall into, nevertheless, you're reporting, the whole report is tabled before Congress on a regular basis, I think. And my concern is that policymakers are able to view the data in a way that certain kinds of policy choices might smack them in the face, even if the scientific group has not been recommending those as policy.
Yeah.
For example, it seems to me, I just took this example of private jets, that because the number of people that have private jets in the United States is so small, and yet their impact is so great, that is a kind of adaptation if you stop that sort of behavior. And that led me to this. So I'd like you to comment on that, but it also led me to this question. I understand that logically you can easily say this is mitigation box and this is an adaptation box. It's a little bit along Anitra's question. But it seems to me that they're really gray areas. And I'm wondering, when you think about adaptation, does it for you sometimes involve stopping activities, or the more strictly logical definition of just adjusting to whatever happens? So could you comment on both of those aspects, please? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Well, one, it's not just adjusting to what happens. It's a yes and it's also stopping activities. That's why things like conservation of wetlands, especially coastal wetlands, are so critical. Because if you're not conserving them, then you can tell exactly what's going to happen, which is you're gonna have emissions that will go into the atmosphere because of the loss of carbon from those, especially from those soils. And so so it's always a yes. And I think within the National Climate Assessment, we try to, you only have a certain number of words and you have colleagues who are incredibly expert in mitigation. And so we tried to draw some boundaries, but we also had conversations at the spaces that were intersections. So if you look in the chapter, part of what the sort of itch you have for that gray area might be partially satisfied by some of the examples that you see in the chapter. I think what you're hitting on is actually something that will be that chapter in the 6th National Climate Assessment that I'm been asked to lead, which is on the science of response management. And that's how adaptation, mitigation, and things like resilience or community resilience all intersect together to create a landscape where we are either sufficiently or insufficiently or effectively or ineffectively responding in the face of climate risks. And you know, I don't know the answer to that. That's why I think it's actually something really important to assess and something that I'm really actually excited to lead. Although I can say, like, if we were adequately responding to climate change, it doesn't matter what the bottom up emission tally sheet says. I can tell from the atmosphere, which is a well-mixed system that tells me within 2 weeks what has been occurring, how well we're doing globally, which is not that well. Like, our emissions are not going down at a rapid rate. We are on a pretty intense trajectory for some very strong, climate change effects. If we can hold to 1.5, it'll be a miracle. So, so I think that will be, I think, really important. And that also links to your question of granularity. Mitigation is in some respects easier because there's a smaller set of indicators and there's mechanisms to account for them bottom up, as well as we have a singular source of authority through our climate that we are able to measure with a phenomenal level of precision that tells us how well we are doing. And if we are bottom up reducing emissions at an aggressive rate, we should see that in our atmosphere in terms of what we're seeing. It doesn't mean that we don't have half-lives to, gases. Like, that still exists. We're still going to have climate change impacts, even if we were able to turn the knob off immediately, because those half-lives of the gases vary, and we're going to have effects for decades. But it doesn't mean that we should, wait to do it. It means we should actually go as fast as possible, because the faster we can turn it off, the more likely the bathtub won't overflow. And so as we think about then what that means in terms of the impact of disaggregated data, in some places we do have disaggregated data that allows us to describe with a higher degree of specificity what is occurring and what's not, and where sources of pollution are and are not present. That's not a policy prescriptive thing. That's literally just the science of what is happening. And so when we talk about policy prescriptive, that means we're not telling people what to do in terms of policy. It doesn't mean it doesn't have high relevance to policies that might be considered within different spaces. In terms of specific approaches, we didn't get, I don't know if other chapters did, I don't remember it in my reading. But we didn't get into looking at things like private jets or cruise ships or other particular things. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist in the literature, but when you have limited space, we made some particular choices of what we thought was most important to include. And being the adaptation chapter, the most important things that we thought to include were thinking about the specific decisions that communities and individuals were making to respond in the face of the climate change they're experiencing.
If I may, just one other
absolutely.
question, and that is, do you attach economic dollars and cents as you look at different measures that either could be taken or have been taken in the past, or is that separate from this report?
We did, there's two things that you'll want to look at. One is there was a specific chapter on the economics. It was an incredibly thoughtful chapter that was really trying to get a sense of what are the costs and benefits and other economic measures related to climate change. In our chapter, we had collaborated a bit with the members of the economic chapter to make sure we weren't redundant, but had a key message that might be prompting this question, key message 6, which was really trying to get a sense of, we know there's a lot of financing that's going on related to adaptation that's happening at different scales. We know there's going to be increasing investments that will need to be made. And we tried to do a deep dive into what we know, like what is scientifically published that we can pull from public data sets and other things. And we were compared to other key messages, we didn't have the same level of confidence in our conclusions that we had with with that financial key message, because the data are just hard to get. There's a number of things, if it's happening in the private sector where we don't have access to data, there might be things that are happening in the public sector where if it's not explicitly called adaptation, it's not tagged in there, for it's difficult to disentangle some of the finances that one might want to know in order to understand the scale of investment that might be made in particular places, things that might be occurring by all intents and purposes, and how we define climate change adaptation. It's climate change adaptation. It's just not called that. Does it necessarily matter? Like, no, if it's achieving the same purpose of reducing climate risks, which are, heat mortality, morbidity, extreme precipitation impacts, flooding, drought, hurricanes, sea level rise. We want people to be able to not be at risk, and we want to make sure that property is set up so that both built-in natural infrastructure is both helping us to reduce risk, but also isn't at risk, that we're protecting people's lives and livelihoods. And
Thank you.
that just means that it's not always called adaptation. That's why it's particularly hard to track financially.
Right. Thank you so much. That was an excellent answer, I thought, and I'll look for that chapter.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Ted Manning, you are on deck for your question and comment, and John Legg, you have the floor.
Thank you, Claude, and thank you very much, Dr. Kenney, for that presentation. If I forget to echo a previous wish to you during this upcoming period, Dave Doherty said, "Good luck." Anyway, I will start a little bit along the way he started, and to say that it's no secret that the views of the president-elect are not favorable to spending a great deal of time on the environment. However, in all democratic governments, there are often some sort of protective measures in many different subject areas against overly negative actions being taken during, should I call it, difficult periods. So without asking you to tread on dangerous ground, can you point towards some informal ideas you might consider exploring with other sympathetic non-governmental bodies, especially not to lose too much ground?
Yeah, and so you don't have to use much imagination to know the different pathways that are likely to occur in the U.S. over the next couple of years. When the first Trump administration came in for the first term, what we saw was a significant decrease in climate-related funding and environmental funding that impacted a wide range of states and communities, as well as academic institutions. If you only were relying on federal dollars, that was a bad situation to be in. If you had a diversified portfolio and you had collaborations with foundation, private sector, state, NGO entities, then there were ways of the priorities shifting, because you weren't relying on one source. I mean, that's in part like a diverse portfolio, regardless of what it is, helps to manage risk. A lot of what we're talking about with climate change is also like having a diverse portfolio of different solutions to be able to manage for your risk. One of the things that my particular research group did. I was based at the University of Maryland. I worked a lot with federal agencies, being quite close to Washington, DC, and continued collaborating with them through the Trump administration. But we actually shifted a pretty significant portion of our portfolio to working with NGOs and the state government, state and local government, where you saw the most aggressive climate action continuing to occur was in the state and local government areas. And in states like Minnesota, we have climate policies, we have energy policies that will be there regardless of the federal administration. And being at a land grant university, we have an obligation to doing research that supports our state making good decisions based off of scientific evidence, and providing them with that information when they're requesting it. And we're right now putting the final touches on a report that the state legislature asked this University of Minnesota to produce, looking at decarbonization and adaptation strategies in the building sector, which is a major sector that they're interested in knowing what the solutions might be. So as I look towards the future, I'm guessing that more of the portfolio might shift to where more of the action is and where more of the science is needed, and that ebb and flow occurs. And regardless of what political party is in any branch of government, we're apolitical. I mean, we work with people across all of the different political spectrums, because there's not just one solution. And when we look at economic risk management, climate adaptation and mitigation strategies are part of economic risk management. It is part of the strategies that businesses need to be thinking about in order to manage shareholder accountability and reporting requirements. And that's one of the reasons why our institute also has a platform where we're looking at deep decarbonization strategies through partnerships between our university and the private sector, Fortune 500 companies and venture capitalists, because we feel like private sector can be a leader in a number of those spaces because of their strategic plans, their KPGs, and also the kind of shareholder reporting that they're increasingly asked to do.
Okay, so you do have many areas you can concentrate on more, right?
I think anyone that doesn't plan for multiple futures
Right.
is foolish, because none of us can fully predict what future will occur. We might be able to put some additional bets on one versus the other, but the incoming federal administration, that was a real possibility. It came to fruition. It means that for certain things we will be shifting our focus, because we can anticipate what will happen given what happened 4 to 8 years ago.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Raymond is on deck, and Ted, you are up. Ask any question and your comment.
Yes, Melissa, that was fabulous. By the way, I think it was. I was in a very similar position in the Canadian government until a few years ago, and as the head of sustainable development research, and also prior to that with running the land use directorate in Canada, and we had the same problems. I mean, we're dealing with holistic issues between the way people actually treated their environment and their land, and subsequently how they understood what sustainability meant and how it would affect them. Now, we still have that problem. We have, I detected from your presentation that you have trouble getting people to believe scientists know anything more than they do, and that is making the press in my country and in yours. It's really a challenge to try and get people to believe. I'm not sure the word truth means anything anymore, but so it is always a challenge. Anyway, I was very impressed with what you said. We have been talking a little bit about some solutions. We have found dealing with issues like climate change adaptation, like getting people to sustain the key life support systems for themselves and their communities. It is a lot easier to do from the bottom up. And we've been assembling globally case studies of success stories of places where they actually have gotten together and integrated their values and looked at really at the actions that could probably support them. Are you assembling success stories at a lower scale in the States to try and come up with an empirical support system of what might work?
So I think there's a couple of things embedded in that. And one is I just put a link in the chat for those of you that are interested. I don't know if you know the Yale and George Mason climate communication. They do these for a long time. They've done these opinion polls where they really take the pulse of climate change within the US, and it's a incredibly rigorous poll. And so if you look at that over time, one of the things that you see is that there's a shift to more and more people worried about climate change, and that there's less of people who have like ennui or are don't necessarily I hate the word like believe in climate change, because it's literally just science.
They can't figure out who to blame. That's the problem.
But if we look at that, there's been a big shift. And so, I mean, one of the things within our institute on the environment is that we feel like there was so much attention to just trying to convince people that this is a problem, that there's a building in the back that needs to be like, we need all hands on deck to put that fire out. And because folks have been worrying about slaying this dragon of like whether or not climate change is real or whether these environmental problems are actually a problem, they weren't paying attention to one of the more critical problems, which is like your entire community is burning down in the background. And so, we feel like that dragon has been slayed, or other people are fighting it in ways where they're going to fight that good fight. We're much more focused on the solutions and thinking through the different pathways. I think there's different scientists who focus on different pieces. And if you look at the portfolio of work that we focus on, we're really focused on not a singular pathway. There's no heroes in this. What we have is we have really effective teams. And if those teams have the same goal in mind, then there are lots of different pathways for us to achieve that linked to multiple different kinds of political ideologies, like religions, community beliefs, like personal values. And we need people to be exploring those through that diversity of pathways, because it's only through that diversity that we can figure out which ones might be even more effective than others. And if it's a singular pathway, as soon as we get into a barrier or there's another dragon that comes up on the path, you're just stuck. So that's a lot of what we've focused on. So I guess like I just pay less attention to the folks who aren't paying attention, like where the science isn't influential. I'm a decision scientist, and I can't convince someone that certain scientific information matters if they've already decided what decision they're going to make. If they haven't, and that scientific information is helpful for them to think through different consequences and trade-offs, that's where I can be helpful. And so I prefer to focus on the places where I can be helpful. And there's going to be a lot of places where we're going to have to make tough trade-offs, and there's not going to be clear answers about what is the right way of moving things forward, because there might be multiple right ways and there might be some very clear things that we should not be doing. And we want to really avoid those clear things we should not be doing.
Well, some politicians say that they can tell you exactly what you shouldn't be doing. And our risk management strategy was to mail our data to somebody else to hang on to until it passed.
Yeah, well, and you do see, you know, regardless of political party, there's a lot more attention to data archiving and attention to making sure that we don't lose the information that we collected. And we are seeing that partially with like publicly available data sources that are available through web sources, that there's some folks that are helping to make sure that we can capture at moments in time what existed on those platforms. So if we ever needed to go back and find something, we'd be able to have access to it.
Well, please keep up the good work.
That I'm a cheerleader for other people doing that, but yes,
Okay.
thank
Thanks
you.
for coming.
Okay, we're in our last 5 minutes. Raymond, you have the floor, and possibly, if there's time, we'll get a question from Art.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I want to make a point that's possibly relatively minor, but it's you made a comment in passing that adoption of EVs was more problematic in remote, rural, and colder areas. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The more rural you are, the more EVs make sense. The reason is simple. So if you look at a gas vehicle or a diesel vehicle, you have to go to some location to get your fuel. When you have an EV, you plug it in at home and you get your fuel that way. If you're in a rural area, you're much more likely, almost certain, to be in a single family home or a very small dwelling, multi-unit dwelling, where it's easy to provide charging infrastructure. Where we have a bigger problem is in dense urban areas where there's large apartment buildings where charging is not widely available, right? So so that being said, when I look at IEA data, and actually I was on a webinar earlier today from Project Drawdown, which you probably are aware of, right? And they were citing IEA data, and again, the IEA data is they have a track record of having a very poor track record of being able to predict future trends. Yet there's lots of government policy that depends on conclusions from the IEA data, right? So I guess I turned this into a question: how much do you depend on that data, and what do you think about their track record and how you could get projections that make more sense?
Yeah, I mean, we look across all data sources. I can't speak specifically to that data source in particular, but I think one of the things that's important to do is to really, whenever you're doing one of these scientific assessments, is to look broadly across the literature, so you're not myopically just focused on people or disciplines that you personally know, and similarly to look across a broad range of data sources. And I think, just then pulling back to some of the questions with EVs, it's not that like the points that you're bringing up about like household accessibility, yes. And what we experience in cold climates is that battery capacity goes down by about half. A lot of the EVs, depending on the battery life, may not be sufficient to be able to get you from point A to point B. And if point B doesn't have a sufficient charger, or you don't have a vehicle at this point that allows you to fast charge, it creates some pain points. And I know this, like I have an EV myself. Like, it's one of those things where when I go into my battery life automatically decreases at this time of year. It's predictable, it's perfectly fine, but it does mean that in certain spaces, because if you don't have a fast charger, you are waiting a couple of hours, which is, it's just a technology like transformation. It will be very different in 5 to 10 years. It just will be. Right now, the pain point is the battery life and the infrastructure.
So which EV do you drive by any chance?
Well, I personally, I drive a RAV4 Prime, which is a gas hybrid because of the battery life, and we also have in my larger family a Tesla.
Okay, so what I'll tell you is, again, there's misinformation, a lot of misinformation out there, and the fact is you don't lose 50% of range in a pure battery electric car. If you're doing long distances, you lose 20% of range, right? And if you look at certain specific cases, you look at Moscow, for example, which has a temperature very similar to what we have here in Ottawa. Many years ago, I don't know what the data is today, but they already had 1,000 electric buses on their streets, and they were working fine, right? So it's a different paradigm, yes, absolutely. But my concern is often, and I've seen this many times in all sorts of studies on energy, that there's a lot of misconception about what EVs pretend to. And also another good example there is a lot of people are saying that heavy duty vehicles are going to take forever to electrify. Okay. Well, if you listen to people who've actually looked at the data and are in the business, they will tell you the exact opposite. So the reason that heavy duty transportation is going to transition faster is because, for my personal vehicle, I make the choice based on perhaps misinformation on my own preferences or my own fears or whatever. Whereas if you're looking at heavy duty fleets, they make decisions based on economics. And if you look at the economics, there's so much money to be saved by electrifying a fleet that we expect that fleets are just going to flip over very rapidly, and it's going to become a situation. If you haven't electrified your fleet, you won't be competitive with your competitor, and you won't be able to survive. So and again,
it's an exciting time, because I think as we look at the transportation sector, like a large scale electrification is our pathway to decarbonization, as well as then also strategies to increase public transportation use and other things. And when we think about that in relationship to adaptation, there are things that we can do, especially as we are adapting our communities, that can make it easier to adopt low carbon transportation approaches, and to have those set up in a way that is reliable amongst the different kinds of climate impacts that we might be facing. And I think this is a great example of where there's it's a growing body of literature. There's a lot of information that's out there, and we're seeing the market transform quite rapidly, which is an exciting place to be. I mean, it's going to be really important for us to continue to accelerate the actions that we are doing to reduce greenhouse gases and to adapt to the impacts that we will be facing in the future.
Yeah, actually, on the heavy duty side, the problem there is that it's diesel, and it's emissions that also have lots of health effects, right?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
The faster we could reduce those, the better it is from many perspectives, right?
Absolutely.
So thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Ted is on deck for giving the thanks, and Art has a very quick comment question.
Sure.
I just wanted to say, Melissa, listening to you, and you did partially answer this question, but it strikes me that in the private sector, it is the insurance industry who are spending 100% of their time on risk collaboration and assessment, and it strikes me that your organization and the insurance industry would probably collaborate very nicely. I don't need an answer.
Absolutely. And if you look at some of the early integrators of pretty sophisticated climate data and information to support business decisions. It was a reinsurance businesses, well over a decade ago. And so, insurance is all about risk management. So I think that that's going to be a really good place to be increasingly looking to see how they are making decisions based off of the kinds of climate adaptation choices that are going into communities and how that then shows up in insurance premiums that are happening at a wide range of different scales. Great point.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ted.
Melissa, I get to talk to you again. Tremendous presentation. I have so many more questions. I may actually get in touch with you at some other
Please
point.
do.
And I will, in fact, be sending my daughter to talk to you because she is in charge of the climate change adaptation program for our National Research Council.
Oh, wonderful.
I wish she could make it, but she was busy. Anyway,
Yeah.
that said, these kinds of linkages can really foster participation and the exchange of ideas. So I learned a lot today. I thought it was wonderful. I think everybody else did too. So we can probably talk again in a year or two to really exchange ideas again, because this is moving so fast. Nobody's going to get bored.
No, I've been wanting to retire early, but I don't think it's going to be possible. So there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work to do, and if we're
Look, I tried to
meet that
retire
goal.
20 years ago, and I never was quite able to do so, even though I'm not employed, but I'm not retired. That's another question. Anyway, again, I'd like to thank you particularly for this presentation, and thank you for the references. And we definitely will ask you back again. And please stay in touch with the others on our panel, because they always meet and they always ask nasty questions to keep our presenters on their toes.
The conversation was so engaging. I'm so appreciative for all of you being part of our sort of virtual kitchen table as we talk about things that are really sticky. I learned a lot from you all as well.
So thank you again, Melissa. And we will just say to people that this will be put on within the next day, where probably Art will tell us if it's take longer, but we should have it on later today or tomorrow. So it's available. Please share it with anyone. It will be available on our website. It will also be put on our YouTube site. And we would just ask everybody who attended, please mail us the money for your membership. But we have a brand new system, and that's what makes all of this feasible. We don't want to dun you too much, but it is not expensive. It's good value for money, and it's time to pay us for Christmas. Right. Have yourself a very good Christmas period. We will be starting this again after Christmas. We're taking a couple of weeks off. And once again, please subscribe when you go onto YouTube, and please share it. Thank you very much, and Merry Christmas.
Thank you.